ThinkTECH Hawaii. Civil engagement lives here. Okay, we're back, we're live. It's Tuesday, wow. And it's a very important show. It's a show at our 5 o'clock block. It's Community Matters, and it's about climate change. It's about science and data on climate change. And we have David S. Vogel, who is a scientist right here and devotes, may I say this, devotes his life to gathering and interpreting data about climate change. Is it fair?
That's a good description for my work for the foundation.
Okay, the foundation is VoLo Foundation.
VoLo Foundation, yes.
Which is a very important foundation to ThinkTECH. And you're also the CEO of VoLo Ridge. Is that right? What is VoLo Ridge?
VoLo Ridge is a quantitative hedge fund based in Florida.
And you're not just any old hedge fund. You were awarded #3 in the world hedge fund in 2015. That hedge fund?
That was in a Barron's ranking, I believe.
Yeah. So, and you're sitting here with me. Thank you very much, David.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Jay.
Hedge fund managers are usually very smart. So are scientists, by that way. And I think it's important to say why you have dedicated so much time and effort individually and through the foundation, VoLo Foundation, about climate change, and to sort of integrate your science, your work, your data analysis with climate change. That's not so easy, and you put in a ton of time on it. Why?
Well, when my wife and I started VoLo Foundation in 2014, we were very focused around fighting poverty, and we once I dug into the data science of climate change, I realized that it's so severe, it's going to affect widespread poverty. Eventually, it'll cause a lot of other problems, and it will affect us in the U.S., both economically and health-wise, as well as a lot of foreign issues from more immigration. So a lot of issues around climate change. It really is an area of philanthropy that's underfunded for how it's great importance to future of our society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and to your credit, you have spent the time and you've been altruistic to the fullest extent. It's kind of major payback what you do, and we really appreciate that. And our tagline for the show, the title for the show is Science and Data about Climate Change, but the tagline is the one that hits me. It's Don't Mess with Mother Nature. So David, you've accumulated data, you've interpreted data as a scientist would, as a data manager would in big data, and you've made some conclusions about don't mess with Mother Nature. What have you found?
Well, I guess a lot of the conclusions I've reached are no different from what a lot of great climate scientists have come up with. I've just found better ways to explain it to people. I have a slide here showing basically the distance from the, well, first of all, this slide shows the increasing damages caused by major climate events. So we used to be in the single-digit billions in damages per year, and now we're getting into the hundreds of billions. So we've been setting records.
And all that within the last few years. The increase is really dramatic.
It's been a steady increase. Every decade, actually, for the last several decades, been doubling or tripling. And now it's getting to the point where it's a substantial part of our GDP. So it's really going to affect the economics of the country as well as the rest of the world.
And people don't necessarily realize it. Well, can you interpret this chart for us? This is it's a what do you call it? Kind of a cumulative bar, and there are elements on the bar. What are the elements in the bars?
Well, the left axis shows number of climate events, and so the height of the bar is the number of climate events, and then the graphs underneath it that are a little harder to see are the hundreds of billions in damages, and those are aligned with the right axis. So it really is just shooting up in terms of damages. And so when we dig into more into the science in the next slide, we can talk about how this is definitively man-made.
Before we leave this, I just want to look at that and ask you how it got created. I mean, you went out, you got the data. Put me in your shoes for a minute. How did you do this?
Well, I decided to play the role of the skeptic and take no data from environmental sources and take nobody's word for for the fact that the climate is changing. And I basically went and looked at, I downloaded buoy data, for example, from the Atlantic for measurements of water temperature and correlated that with the increasing hurricane intensity. I downloaded data from glaciers to look at to graph the data points of temperature versus carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, so that I could come up with my own estimate. And I came up with my own estimate of about 3 degrees Celsius of warming, and that's if no more fossil fuel emissions are put out there.
So this is big data. This is global data, and this is data that you as a data scientist could manage and interpret, and that chart reflects your interpretation of the big data you downloaded. This sounds so much like, we have a program called Research in Manoa on Mondays, and they come down from the School of Ocean, Earth Science and Technology at UH Manoa, from the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology, and they talk about their efforts with big data. They talk about accumulating it from all kinds of sources in huge volumes of data and interpreting it. And that's how they earn their PhDs, one after the other, doing that, and that's exactly what it sounds like you do now.
And right, and I do a lot of work in big data, but this is actually much simpler. It's actually, I call it little data, because a few data points you can actually prove that global warming is completely man-made, and it's pretty severe. And so the next slide really gets into that illustration.
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Don't forget that point 1 on the exam is this is all man-made. Am I right?
That's correct.
Okay. What does the slide say?
And so this slide basically shows the concept of what carbon dioxide does for when it's in the atmosphere. You got the Earth and the Earth and the Moon about the same distance from the sun, and yet the Moon's at -3 degrees and the Earth's at more than 60 degrees warmer. And so this is something that's been studied for 200 years. 200 years ago, physicists were figuring out
Nothing new here.
Right. So when people say climate science is a new science, this is 200-year-old physics. It's the same science we believe in when we fly in a plane.
Yeah.
So basically they figured out hundreds of years ago, and never disputed ever since, that what keeps us warm is the 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that are naturally in our atmosphere.
And so the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is warming us. Am I right about this? And the more carbon dioxide you have, the more carbon you have, the warmer you are. Am I right?
That's correct. Now I'm giving a simplified version. There are other greenhouse gases, but by far the largest driver is carbon dioxide. And 2 trillion tons is actually a good amount. It's the naturally occurring amount. Without any carbon dioxide, we'd be freezing to death. So 2 trillion tons is a good, healthy amount.
Interesting.
Now, 150 years later, after all this industry, we measure 3 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. So if 2 trillion tons is the difference between freezing to death and 60 degrees warmer, you can imagine, and it doesn't take a physicist to recognize that 3 trillion tons, the 50% increase is pretty severe warming potential.
Yeah, and a thing that wasn't so bad has turned much worse.
That's right. So then a lot of the skeptics will argue, well, how do we know it's man-made? Is this a natural cycle? And it's actually very easy. So again, I said not pretending not to believe any environmental scientist. You download data available to the public from oil and gas sources, where they publish the energy consumption.
Which are reputable sources, unassailable sources.
Right. I mean, anybody can Google BP energy report and see the annual consumption of coal globally is 5.5 billion tons, and the annual consumption of oil is 35 billion barrels. Take the 35 billion barrels, we know it doesn't take much research to know the average weight of a barrel is 275 pounds. You just do some multiplication and addition, and you get 30 billion tons a year of carbon dioxide that are man-made.
It's easy.
So you actually add it up, and we've accounted for every molecule of that additional 1 trillion tons in the atmosphere. And if we don't stop what we're doing, 35 years times another 35 years times 30 billion, we'll have 4 trillion tons,
Right.
which is even
And
more
that much
devastating.
worse.
Yes.
Well, I guess this is really profoundly important that we understand this. But Query, you have written this. I've seen your writing. I've seen your graphs and charts. I've seen your work, and I talked to you. And we had a show with you and Howard Wigg, one of our other hosts here a year ago. Where are you publishing this? Where are you telling the story? And how are you getting it out to the people who need to know about it?
Well, I'm telling the story to whoever will listen, first of all. Being on this
Fair enough.
This show twice, I communicate this information with various environmental groups. For example, Environmental Defense Fund. They have a lot of contacts in politics and share this information. I gave a talk with investment group at an investment conference, and we fund some groups that just go around educating people.
Because, aside from the political aspect, you talk to an investment group, you're talking about the possibility of impact investing.
Yeah.
So that you should invest in, funds, including hedge funds, should invest in projects and issues that are safe for the environment. So you must have a fair amount of leverage when you go and present to a group like that, because if they take your advice, they could have a big effect on how much carbon we put in the atmosphere, no?
And that's correct. I think investors are starting to recognize that there is risk involved with carbon-dependent businesses. That at some point, the climate's going to get so bad, and restrictions are going to be put on them that creates a good degree of risk. And we actually published a set of risks on every oil and gas company there is.
That's good, and we should do that. So my question, I suppose, is what comes to mind here is what is the state of awareness now in the world? We know the state of awareness in Washington is unawareness, or at least denial. But what is it like on a global basis? Is humanity sufficiently aware of these issues and these conclusions that you make?
Well, in some countries, certainly more than others. In the U.S., we are severely underaware of the risks of climate change. I have a slide on that that shows what a poll of the American public and what the most important issues were prior to the 2016 election.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We have that slide up now. To me, this is fascinating, David, because you have to assume, and sometimes who knows what is in the mind of the electorate and the public. Sometimes 300 million Americans can be wrong. Entirely possible. I think that happens frequently these days. But this slide shows you what the priorities are. However they got to be the way they are ordered on this slide. Right. And these are the wrong priorities.
Well, specifically, environment being number 12 on here, I believe third from the bottom, that Americans don't consider that an important issue to address. And so people like to point fingers. They say, well, okay, it's the oil and gas companies, they're the bad guys. They're causing all the carbon emissions. And very interestingly, I spoke with John Hofmeister, who's the former CEO of Shell Oil Corporation. He actually wrote an entire book on how to get away from carbon, and shows in the book how policy cannot allow the energy companies to make that conversion. So even people in big oil companies recognize that hey, this is important for improving the lives of our children. So then you point to the politicians and you say, hey, well, why are the politicians doing nothing? And you look at this poll. I've gotten quite a bit of feedback from congressmen who are pretty well aware of the importance of climate change. Even even Republicans are
Even Republicans. But they have political cover because of polls like this.
Right.
Because the public is not aware. They do not see it as a priority, and therefore the politicians, even if they know better, are saying, well, the public doesn't care, why should I care? I'm following the public. And that way they have the defense of a poll like this. It's cover.
Right, right. And I'm not trying to be partisan in any way. This really should be a bipartisan issue. It's just the politicians are going with what their constituents want to see, or else they won't get reelected to be able to make any impact.
Sure. And you know, but I tell you the truth, just one thought here. I expect politicians and the officials I elect to apply some wisdom, even if the polls go the other way. I expect them to save our society and use the best knowledge and analysis they can possibly use. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way these days. Yeah.
Right. And I think if a certain percentage of the American public comes to realize that this is a huge issue, then politicians will follow and do basically what their constituents want them to fight for.
We're going to go to a break, but before we do, back to that chart for 1 minute. Just an example of something that is not important, and yet that is shown to have a priority, at least in the minds of the public, more than environment. Can you give me an example of one of the stark priorities that is on top of environment here?
Well, the top four, interestingly, are hugely affected by climate change. So the number one issue, economy, will be crushed by enough warming. I mean, we see the economic impact.
Nobody sees the connection.
In hundreds of billions in damages. So we're crushing the number one issue. It also affects the foreign policy and national security, so number 2 and 3. And it affects healthcare, as we've seen more sicknesses. So the top four issues all will be affected greatly by climate change. Hence, the environment really should be number one.
Should be number one.
Yeah.
There you have it. That point will be on the final exam. We're going to take a short break now, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the ghost of Christmas future and what is going to happen and where if we don't resolve these problems and deal with climate change. David S. Vogel will be right back.
Do you want to be cool like me? If so, watch my show on Tuesdays at 1 called Out of the Comfort Zone. I sang this song to you because I think you either are cool or have the potential to be seriously cool. And I want you to come watch my show where I bring in experts who talk all about easy strategies to be healthier, happier, build better relationships, and make your life a success. So come sit with the cool kids at Out of the Comfort Zone on Tuesdays at 1. See you there.
Hello, I'm Yukari Kunisue. I'm your host of new Japanese language show on ThinkTECH Hawaii called Konnichiwa Hawaii, broadcasting live every other Monday at 2 p.m. Please join us where we discuss important and useful information for the Japanese language community in Hawaii. The show will be all in Japanese. Hope you can join us every other Monday at 2 p.m. Aloha.
It's community matters at the heart of things. It's climate change. It's science and data. David S. Vogel, who is a data scientist, and he runs VoLo Foundation, which is dedicated to trying to make the public aware about the problem, the significant problem to humanity, the risk to humanity with climate change. We're calling this show Science and Data about Climate Change, and our tagline for it is "Don't mess with Mother Nature," because indeed we are messing with Mother Nature. So if I give you the problem of the ghost of Christmas future, David Vogel, what do you see? If we don't do anything, if we let these processes that you identified from the data continue without dealing with them, trying to reverse them, what happens to the Earth? What happens to humanity?
Well, I've got a slide that points out how it'll affect different parts of the U.S. It'll definitely affect places all over the world. I mean, we have entire countries sinking, going as water level rises and the ice caps.
It's already happening.
But let's be selfish for a moment and just look at the U.S. and its impact. We got extreme hurricanes, probably the #1 in terms of dollars damage. We saw what happened to Maria in Puerto Rico. We lost power for months, basically. So big storms can basically shut down our economy. We got huge, expensive droughts in the Northwest. We've got flooding anywhere that's coastal, and especially coastal cities where it's very expensive to deal with that because increasing temperatures were just melting the ice in the polar ice caps, and so we just get higher and higher sea level until we address this problem.
Getting worse, getting more extreme.
That's right.
And we have now probably going to affect Hawaii. We have El Nino, which means more extreme weather, and we're heading into the hurricane season, which means, well, extreme weather. We've seen, the floods here in Oahu. We've seen the floods on Kauai. Seen a lot of damage, and that wasn't even in the hurricane season. This is getting pretty threatening. I always wonder when they come on television, at least here in the United States, and they say, oh, we have a flood, oh, we have a storm. What they really need to say right after they announce that is, and this is part of climate change. They don't say that. Right. They leave it to the public to connect the dots, and the public doesn't generally connect the dots.
Right, and you really can't, you can't connect a single storm to climate change, but collectively, when you see the amount of hurricane damages doubling and tripling every decade for the last 4 or 5 decades, that's significant.
Yeah, that's why we have to look at the data and plot the data out and make data conclusions. That's the nature of our computer science these days, really, to be able to do that.
Right, and again, I mentioned I analyzed some of the data myself from buoys. You can correlate 81, 82 sea level water pretty much with Category 1 and Category 2 hurricanes. Below 80 degree water, you don't see any hurricanes ever. 84, 85 degree water, the hurricane's almost always Category 4 or 5. So a few degrees is huge. It's the difference between a Category 1 hurricane causing a few billion in damage to Category 4 that's over 100 billion in damage.
So do you find that these increases in damages, increases in the severity of the storms and the sea level rise, is it just a straight line up, or is it sort of a logarithmic line up? Is there a geometrical progression, or is it just mathematical?
It's actually, it is mathematical, but it's more than linear. The frequency of storms is actually fairly linear with the water temperature. But you're not only getting more storms, but you're getting more intense storms. So the cost per storm is going up.
Yeah.
So it really is it's curving up a lot more than linear.
And when you talk about, the extreme weather and the temperature and the data that you have, you're really not including the biological effects of that. For example, if I give you 2 degrees in ocean temperature, that's going to change the biological life in the ocean. It's going to change the bacteria. It's going to change the survivability of various species there. It's going to change the viral, context of the ocean water. There are people here that are researching those things, and it's very, it's early science. We don't know yet. We'll find out the hard way.
Right.
2 degrees could mean, extraordinary things that do affect people.
And those are all the unpredictable effects. So I'm focusing on the predictable effects are actually large enough that it's cost efficient to do something about.
Yeah.
Then you got all the unpredictable effects. So the true price of carbon is pretty up there.
So let's talk about what has been done by knowledgeable, aware, societies and countries around the world, and what needs to be done in order to make a reasonable attempt to deal with climate change. Who has been the heroes in the war against climate change?
Well, Sweden is a good example to follow. Sweden is at least 25 years ahead of the U.S. in terms of climate policy. 1995 is when they implemented their first carbon tax. they do everything right from they got more efficient homes, more R&D on energy efficiency, moving toward electric cars, and interestingly, their GDP has gone up. It's actually accelerated upward.
That's very interesting.
While their carbon emissions gone down. So since their carbon emissions has gone down 23% in the time that their GDP has gone up something like 45%.
Do you have a thought about why that is? Because, you know, another approach and a naysayer, denier person would say, oh, if you do all those things to deal with climate change, you know, you're spending all this money and that's going to degrade your economy. And you're saying just the opposite. What's the mechanism by which this happens?
Well, it stimulates the economy. It creates jobs. So we live in an era where more things are being automated and people need jobs. So this is actually a good time to be adding jobs in an area that will actually protect the environment.
Well, this takes us to learning from Sweden, and I suppose there are other countries in Europe that are, you know, very progressive about this sort of thing and recognize it more than the U.S. But, you know, if you were going to look at, if I made you, David, and I like to do this, if I made you king of the universe, and I'm doing that now for a moment, what would you do to save the planet, to save the species, the human species?
Well, a couple of things. Well, first of all, common sense would say, let's see who's made it work and follow their lead. So I'd look at what Sweden's done and implement some of the same aspects because it's working for them. It's cutting emissions and stimulating their economy. Secondly, if I had to do one thing that could probably change the change the course of the direction, it would be apply a price on carbon. We can estimate reasonably that the price of carbon is at least $50 a ton. The reason why is we can easily project 50 trillion in damages over the next, say, 50 years for the 1 trillion tons of carbon added. So divide that and you get $50 a ton. I actually believe it's more exponential, maybe more like $150. So if we applied $150 a ton carbon tax, we actually know, first of all, it would change the motivations. It wouldn't say, it's not illegal to emit carbon, but people would just buy smaller cars and it will all of a sudden be more economical to get solar panels on your roof. And interestingly, that price is market tested because we have had oil. That tax corresponds about $40 or $50 per barrel. We actually paid that much for oil back around 2007 when OPEC raised the prices like crazy. So that's actually a market tested economic incentive. Except in this case, we wouldn't be paying someone else. We could actually apply those dollars to either cover the damages caused by carbon emissions or for other economic benefit.
Well, from a tipping point of view, you know, if you had Sweden doing a carbon tax, or maybe a few other countries in Scandinavia or continental Europe, whatever it is, and being good about it, being progressive and being disciplined about it, that's probably not enough to save the world. Where do we go? I mean, if you're king of the universe, how much of the world, how many countries, what percentage of all the nations and communities and societies would have to buy into the notion of a carbon tax before we are in the clear?
Well, the U.S. is a huge part of the problem. We are 25% of all global emissions. So we have control, and we're actually the one country not in the Paris Agreement like working with all the other countries to lower emissions. So we can control that 25%, and we'll receive the benefit both of that, lowering our own emissions, and from other countries chipping in and lowering theirs.
Yeah. So
it's really very doable. Now, you mentioned saving the planet. Well, I mean, the planet's going to be fine. It's kind of
there won't be any people around.
We're talking about one thing people think about environmentalists is that we're all tree huggers, but we actually do this for humanity and for our country. So the environment would actually be fine warming up and just getting rid of people.
Yeah.
It's really people and our lifestyle and the quality of lives of our children that we're trying to protect here.
And being alive.
That's true. I mean, so saving the planet isn't necessary. The planet will be fine. It'll just become more and more painful to live on it.
Point. Yeah. So, but when you say 25% of the emissions are emanating from the United States, and I'm asking about tipping point. It sounds to me like if the United States would get on board about this, if the United States would adopt a carbon tax, if the United States would be as disciplined and concerned about the species and the planet as Sweden is, because of its 25%, it would have a very salient effect on the global process. And if it joined COP20, what is COP22 or 3, whatever's happening now, and got involved in the international discussion and participated in the international initiative about this, that would have a huge effect on the ability of humankind to deal with this problem, to survive. Isn't it true?
It's true. I mean, in years past, the U.S. was a leader amongst nations. Now we're lagging behind. We're not leading anymore.
Yeah.
And we have that control with 25% of the emissions being our own and influence over other nations. We as a country should be leading this effort. Okay,
so now we're at the end of our show, David Vogel, and I'd like you to talk to the American public for a moment. Okay, they're right behind camera 1 over there. How can they participate in saving the planet, or saving humanity on the planet and dealing with climate change? What does the average Joe or the average Jay or the average David have to do to get to a place where we can have a reasonable response to climate change?
Well, the first thing is raise awareness, be aware that this is the #1 issue. Vote in that direction so that your politicians will make waves in Washington. And while we're try to influence, send this message to your friends and people you know. In terms of while we're waiting for everybody to jump on board, there's lists of things you can do at home to be more efficient and use less electricity. NRDC, for example, nrdc.org has a good list of the top 10 things you can do individually within your home and driving habits to lower your carbon footprint. So lots can be done as an individual.
It's connected, isn't it? It's connected that you should speak to the government about it, but you'd also practice it at home. It's a matter of ordering your own priorities to put this one on the top wherever you go and whatever you do.
And that's correct. And do it not just for yourself, but for your children, because this is a generational thing. We all do what we think is best for our kids. This is truly what's best for them.
Talk about altruism. Thank you so much, David. David, it's Vogel, VoLo Foundation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay.